Hi, I'm John Grisham. I'm on the farm in Virginia in quarantine, like the rest of the world, and suffering through the pandemic. I have a book coming out in 3 weeks. It's called Camino Winds. And so, what I'm going to do to maybe help you pass some time is to read the first chapter of Camino Winds. 3 years ago, I published a book called Camino Island. It's a fictional story that takes place in a small island in Florida. And so Camino Winds is sort of a sequel to Camino Island. A lot of the same characters, different plot. It's a sort of murder mystery that I hope you will enjoy. So here's the first chapter of Camino Winds. Chapter 1, The Landing, Part 1. Leo spun to life in late July in the restless waters of the far eastern Atlantic, about 200 miles west of Cape Verde. He was soon spotted from space, properly named, and classified as a mere tropical depression. Within hours, he had been upgraded to a tropical storm. For a month, strong, dry winds had swept across the Sahara and collided with the moist fronts along the equator, creating swirling masses that moved westward as if searching for land. When Leo began his journey, there were three named storms ahead of him, all in a menacing row that threatened the Caribbean. All three would eventually follow their expected routes and bring heavy rains to the islands, but nothing more. From the beginning, though, it was apparent that Leo would go where no one predicted. He was far more erratic and deadly. When he finally petered out from exhaustion over the Midwest, he was blamed for $5 billion in property damages and 35 deaths. But before that, he wasted no time with his classifications, advancing swiftly from a tropical depression to tropical storm to a full-blown hurricane. At Category 3, with winds of 120 miles an hour, he hit the Turks and Caicos head-on and blew away several hundred homes, killing 10. He skirted low beneath Crooked Island, took a slight left, and aimed for Cuba before stalling south of Andros. His eye weakened as he lost steam and limped across Cuba, once again as a lowly depression, but with plenty of rain but unimpressive winds. He turned south in time to flood Jamaica and the Caymans, and then, in a startling 12-hour period, he reorganized with a perfect eye and turned north toward the warm and inviting waters of the Gulf of Mexico. His trackers drew a line straight to Biloxi, the usual target, but by then they knew better than to make predictions. Leo seemed to have a mind of his own and no use for their models. Once again, he rapidly grew in size and speed, and in less than 2 days had his own news special on cable, and Vegas was posting odds on the landing site. Dozens of giddy camera crews raced into harm's way. Warnings were posted from Galveston to Pensacola. Oil companies scurried to extract 10,000 rig workers from the Gulf, and as always, jacked up the prices at the pump just for the hell of it. Evacuation plans in 5 states were activated. Governors held press conferences. Fleets of boats and airplanes scrambled to reposition inland. As a Category 4, and veering east and west along a steady northbound track, Leo seemed destined for an historic and ugly landfall. And then he stalled again. 300 miles south of Mobile, he faked to his left, began a slow turn to the east, and weakened considerably. For 2 days, he chugged along with Tampa in his sights, then suddenly came to life again as a Category 1. For a change, he maintained a straight course, and his eye passed over St. Petersburg with winds of 100 miles an hour. Flooding was heavy, electricity was knocked out, flimsier buildings were flattened, but there were no fatalities. He then followed Interstate 4 and dumped 10 inches of rain on Orlando and 8 on Daytona Beach, before leaving land as yet another tropical depression. The weary forecasters said farewell as he limped into the Atlantic. Their models ran him out to sea where he would do little more than frighten some cargo ships. However, Leo had other plans. 200 miles due east of St. Augustine, he turned north and picked up steam as his center spun together tightly for the third time. The models were reshuffled and new warnings were issued. For 48 hours, he moved steadily along, gaining strength as he eyed the coast as if selecting his next target. Part 2. At Bay Books, in the town of Santa Rosa on Camino Island, the chatter among the clerks and customers was of nothing but the storm. Indeed, across the island, as well as from Jacksonville to the south and Savannah to the north, everyone was watching Leo and talking about him nonstop. By now, most folks were well informed and could say with authority that no Florida beach north of Daytona had taken a direct hit in decades. There had been plenty of glancing blows as the hurricanes hurried north toward the Carolinas. One theory was that the Gulf Stream, 60 miles out, acted as a barrier to protect the Florida beaches, and it would do so again with pesky Leo. Another theory was that the luck had run out, and it was time for the big one. The models were a hot topic. The Hurricane Center in Miami was now plotting a trajectory that sent Leo farther out to sea without landfall. But the Europeans had him coming ashore south of Savannah as a Category 4, with massive flooding in the low country. If Leo had proved anything, though, it was that he cared nothing for their models. Bruce Cable, the owner of Bay Books, kept one eye on the Weather Channel while he hustled customers and chided his staff to get about their business. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, and Bruce bought into the legend that Camino Island was immune to dangerous hurricanes. He had been there for 24 years and had never seen a destructive storm. His store hosted at least 4 readings a week, and a major appearance was on for tomorrow night. Surely Leo would not disrupt the pleasant homecoming Bruce had planned for one of his favorite writers. Mercer Mann was ending a 2-month summer tour that had been wildly successful. Her second novel, Tessa, was the talk of the trade and currently in the top 10 on all the bestseller lists. Its reviews were glowing, and it was selling faster than anyone had expected. Labeled literary fiction, as opposed to one of the more popular genres, it had seemed destined for the lower rungs of the lists if it made it at all. Its publisher, along with its author, had dreamed of selling 30,000 in hardcover and e-book combined, but the novel was already beyond that. Mercer had deep roots on the island, having summered there as a girl with her grandmother, Tessa, the inspiration for the novel. 3 years earlier, she had spent a month on the beach in the family cottage and managed to entangle herself in some local mischief. She also had a quick fling with Bruce, just another in his long line of trysts. But Bruce wasn't thinking about another fling, or at least he was trying to convince himself he wasn't. He was busy running the store and drumming up a crowd for Mercer's big event. Bay Books was a powerhouse on the national bookstore circuit because Bruce could always pull in a crowd and move the inventory. The New York publishers clamored to get their writers to the island, and many of them were young ladies on the road and looking for a good time. Bruce loved writers, and he wined them and dined them, promoted their books, and partied with them. Mercer had been down that road and wasn't going back, primarily because she was being escorted on her summer tour by a new boyfriend. Bruce didn't care. He was just delighted she was on the island and riding high with a superb new novel. He had read The Galleys 6 months earlier and had been promoting it ever since. As usual, when he loved a book, he sent dozens of handwritten notes to friends and customers touting Tessa. He had called booksellers across the country and encouraged them to stock up. He had chatted with Mercer for hours on the phone and advised her on where to tour, what stores to avoid, which reviewers to ignore. and which journalist to spend time with. He had even passed along some unsolicited editorial comments, some of which she appreciated, some she ignored. Tessa was her breakout novel, her golden moment to establish a career that Bruce had believed in since her first book, which had been largely neglected. She had never stopped adoring him, the little fling aside, although along with a rather serious breach of confidence that surrounded it, for which he had already forgiven her. Bruce was a lovable though roguish character and an undeniable force in the brutal world of bookselling. Part 3. They met for lunch the day before her appearance at a restaurant at the end of Main Street in Santa Rosa, 6 blocks from the bookstore. Lunch for Bruce was always in a downtown restaurant with a bottle of wine or two, and usually with a sales rep or a visiting writer or one of the locals he supported. Business lunches with receipts saved for the accountant. He arrived a few minutes early and went straight to his favorite table on the deck with a view of the busy harbor. He flirted with the waitress and ordered a bottle of Sancerre. When Mercer swept in, he stood and hugged her and offered a firm handshake to Thomas, her companion these days. They took their seats, and Bruce poured the wine. Leo had to be discussed because he was still out there, but Bruce quickly dismissed him as nothing but a distraction. "He's headed to Nag's Head," he said with confidence. Mercer was prettier than ever, her long dark hair cut shorter, her hazel eyes glowing with all the success that a bestseller could bring. She was tired of the tour, thrilled to be finished with it, but also savoring the moment. 34 stops in 51 days, she said with a smile. "You're lucky," Bruce said. "As you well know, publishers don't like to spend money these days. You're killing it, Mercer. I've seen 18 reviews, all but one positive." "Did you see Seattle?" she asked. "That jerk doesn't like anything. I know him. I called him when I saw the review and said harsh things." "Bruce, really?" "Oh no, it's my job. I protect my writers. I'll punch him if I ever meet him." Thomas laughed and said, "Hit him a lick for me." Bruce raised his glass and said, "Come on, cheers to Tessa, number 5 on the Times list and moving up." They took a celebratory sip of wine. Mercer said, "It's still hard to believe." "And a new contract," Thomas said, glancing furtively at her. "Can we break the news?" "It's already broken," Bruce said. "Let's hear it. I want the details." Mercer smiled again and said, "My agent called this morning. Viking is offering a nice sum for 2 more books." Bruce raised his glass again and said, "Awesome. Those people aren't stupid. Congratulations, Mercer. Great news." Of course, Bruce wanted all the details, especially the amount of the nice sum, but he had a general idea. Mercer's agent was a tough old pro who knew the business and could now negotiate a new 2-book deal for 7 figures. After years of struggling, Ms. Mann was entering a new world. "And foreign rights?" Bruce asked. "We start selling them next week," she said. Mercer's first 2 books had barely sold stateside. There were no foreign royalties. Bruce said, "The Brits and Germans will snap it up. The French and Italians will love Tessa when it's translated. It's their kind of story, and they'll be easy to deal with. You'll be in 20 languages before you know it, Mercer. This is incredible." She looked at Thomas and said, "See what I mean? He knows the business." They clinked glasses again as the waitress approached. "This calls for champagne," Bruce announced, and quickly ordered a bottle before anyone could object. He asked about the tour and wanted the scoop on all the bookstores she had visited. He knew virtually every serious bookseller in the country and visited as many as possible. For Bruce, a vacation was a week in Napa or Santa Fe for food and wine, but also to scout out the best independent bookstores and network with their owners. He asked about Square Books in Oxford, one of his favorites. Bay Books was modeled after it. These days, Mercer was living in Oxford and teaching creative writing at Ole Miss, a 2-year gig with 1 year to go in the hope of a permanent position. The success of Tessa would put her on a tenure track, at least in Bruce's opinion, and he was scheming of ways to help. The waitress poured champagne and took their orders. They toasted the new contract again as the clock seemed to stop. Thomas, who had done little but listen, said, Mercer warned me that you take your lunches seriously. Bruce smiled and replied, Indeed, I work from early to late, and at noon I have to get out of the store. That's my excuse. I usually nap off lunch mid-afternoon. Mercer had been coy about her new friend. She had made it clear that she was seeing someone and that he would have all of her attention. Bruce respected that and was truly pleased she had found a steady, and not a bad-looking one. Thomas appeared to be in his late 20s, a few years younger than Mercer. Bruce began chipping away. He said, She tells me you're a writer too. Thomas smiled and said, Yes, and quite unpublished. I'm one of her MFA students. Bruce chuckled at this and said, Sleeping with the professor. That'll get you high marks. Come on, Bruce, Mercer said, but she was smiling. What's your background, Bruce asked. Thomas said, Degree in American Lit from Grinnell, 3 years as a staff writer for The Atlantic, freelance stuff for a couple of online magazines, about 3 dozen short stories and 2 dreadful novels, all fittingly unpublished. I'm hanging around Ole Miss doing the MFA thing and trying to figure out the future. For the past 2 months, I've been carrying her luggage and having a good time. Mercer added, bodyguard, chauffeur, publicist, personal assistant, and he's a beautiful writer. I'd like to see some of your stuff, Bruce said. Mercer looked at Thomas and said, I told you, Bruce is always eager to help. Thomas said, Deal. When I have something worth reading, I'll let you know. Mercer knew that before dinner, Bruce would dig online and find every story Thomas had written for The Atlantic and every other publication and would have a fairly firm opinion about his talents. The crab salads arrived and Bruce poured more champagne. He noticed that his 2 guests were so far light drinkers. It was a habit he couldn't shake. At every lunch and dinner table, at every bar, Bruce noticed. Most of the female writers he entertained hit the booze lightly. Most of the males were hard drinkers. A few were in recovery, and for those, Bruce stuck strictly to iced tea. Not a very good sentence. He looked at Mercer and said, And your next novel? Come on, Bruce. I'm living the moment and writing nothing these days. We have 2 more weeks here before classes start, and I'm determined not to write a single word. Smart, but don't wait too long. That 2-book contract will get heavier as the days go by, and you can't wait 3 years before the next novel. Okay, she said, but can I have just a few days off? 1 week, Bruce said, that's all. Look, dinner tonight will be a blast. Are you up for it? She said, of course, all the gang. They wouldn't miss it, Mercer. They miss you. Noelle is in Europe, and she sends her regards, but everybody else is quite eager to see you. They've all read the book and love it. And how's Andy, she asked. Still sober, so he won't be there. His last book was pretty good and sold well. He's writing a lot. You'll see him around. I've thought about him a lot. He's such a sweet guy. He's doing well, Mercer. The gang is still together and looking forward to a long dinner. Part 4. Thomas excused himself to find the restroom, and as soon as he was gone, Bruce leaned in and said, Does he know about us? What about us? She asked. You've forgotten already? our little weekend together? It was delightful, as I recall. Don't know what you're talking about, Bruce. It never happened. Okay, fine with me, and nothing about the manuscripts. What manuscripts? That's a part of my past I'm trying to forget. Wonderful. No one knows but you, me, Noel, and of course the folks who paid the ransom. Nothing from me, she said, took a sip of wine, leaned in low herself. But where's all that money, Bruce? Buried offshore and drawing interest. I have no plans to touch it. But it's a fortune. Why are you still working so hard? A big smile, a big sip. He said, this is not work, Mercer. This is who I am. I love this business, and I would be lost without it. Does this business still include dabbling in the black market? Of course not. There are too many people watching right now, and obviously I don't need that anymore. So you've gone straight. Clean as a whistle. I love the world of rare books, and I'm even buying more these days, all legit. From time to time, I get approached with something suspicious. There's still a lot of thievery out there, and I confess that I'm tempted. It's too dicey. At the moment, she said. At the moment, he said. She shook her head and smiled, said, you're hopeless, Bruce. A hopeless flirt, philanderer, and book thief. True? And I'll also sell more copies of your book than anybody else. You gotta love me, Mercer. I wouldn't call it love. Okay, how about adoration? I'll try that. Changing the subject, is there anything I should know about tonight? I don't think so. Everyone is excited to see you again. There were some questions when you disappeared 3 years ago, but I covered for you. Said you had some family drama back home, wherever home might be. Then you got a couple of gigs teaching and just haven't had the time to get back. Same characters? Yes, minus Noel, as I said. Andy will probably drop by for a glass of water and say hello. He asks about you. There's a new writer you might find interesting. His name's Nelson Kerr, a former lawyer with a big firm in San Francisco. He ratted out a client, a defense contractor who was illegally selling high-tech military stuff to the Iranians and North Koreans, nice guys like that. It was a big stink about 10 years ago. Now it's long since been forgotten. Why would I follow that, she asked. Right, anyway, his career flamed out, but he collected a ton of money for blowing the whistle. Now he's sort of hiding out. Early 40s, divorced, no kids, keeps to himself. This place attracts the misfits, doesn't it? Always has, Bruce said. He's a nice guy but doesn't say much. Bought a nice condo down by the Hilton, travels a lot. What about his books? He writes what he knows. International arms smuggling, money laundering, good thrillers. Sounds awful. Does he sell? So, but he has potential. You wouldn't like his stuff, but you'd probably like him. Thomas returned and the conversation switched to the latest publishing scandal. Part 5. Bruce lived in a Victorian home 10 minutes by foot from Bay Books. After the obligatory post-lunch siesta in his office at the store, he left in mid-afternoon, walked home to prepare for dinner. Even in the depths of summer, he preferred to have his fancy meals on the veranda, under a couple of creaky old fans, and next to a gurgling fountain. His favorite cuisine came from South Louisiana, and for the evening he had hired Chef Claude, a bona fide Cajun who had been on the island for 30 years. He was already in the kitchen, whistling as he hovered over a large copper pot on the stove. They bantered for a moment, but Bruce knew better than to hang around. The chef was a big talker, and when fully engaged, often forgot about his food. Excuse me a second. It's water. The temperature was in the low 90s, and Bruce went upstairs to change. He peeled out of his daily seersucker and bow tie and put on grungy shorts and a t-shirt and no shoes. Back in the kitchen, he opened 2 cold bottles of beer, gave one to the chef, and took the other one to the veranda to set the table. At these moments, he really missed Noelle. She imported antiques from the south of France and was a master at decorating. Her favorite chore was preparing a table for a dinner party. Her collection of vintage china, glasses, and flatware was astonishing and still growing. Some she bought to stock her store, but the rare stuff, the most beautiful, she kept for her private use. In Noelle's book, a gorgeous table was a gift to their guests, and no one could do it like her. She often photographed them both before and during the dinners, and framed the best ones to hang for customers to admire. The table was 12 feet long, and for centuries had been used as a winery in southern France. They had found it together years earlier when they spent a month on a shopping spree. Flush with ill-gotten cash, they had virtually raided Provence and bought so much stuff that they had to rent space in a warehouse in Avignon. On a sideboard in the dining room, Noelle had carefully laid out the perfect dishes. 12 vintage porcelain plates that had been hand-painted for a minor count in the 1700s. Lots of silverware, 6 pieces for each setting, and dozens of glasses for water and wine and digestifs. The wine glasses were often problematic. Evidently, Noelle's French ancestors didn't drink as much as Bruce's American writers, and the old glasses held barely 3 ounces when fully loaded. At a rowdy dinner party years earlier, Bruce and his guests had become frustrated with the need to refill the dainty glasses every 10 minutes or so. Since then, he insisted on more modern versions that held 8 ounces of red wine, 6 for white. Noelle, who drank little, had acquiesced and found a collection of goblets from Burgundy that would impress an Irish rugby team. Next to the dishes was a detailed diagram of the proper setting that she had prepared 3 days earlier when she left town. Bruce went about the business of arranging the linen placemats, the silk table runners, the candelabras, and then dishes and glasses. The florist arrived and fussed over the table as she rearranged things and bickered with Bruce. When the table was perfect, according to her, Bruce took a photo and sent it to Noelle, who was somewhere in the Alps with her other companion. It was of magazine quality and ready for a dozen guests, though with their dinners the exact number was never certain until the food was served. Strays often materialized at the last moment and added to the fun. Bruce went to the fridge for another beer. Part 6. Cocktails were scheduled for 6 p.m. However, the guests were a bunch of writers, and none would dare arrive before 7. Myra Beckwith and Lee Train showed up first and entered without knocking. Bruce met them on the veranda and mixed a rum and soda for Lee and poured a stout ale for Myra. The ladies had been a couple for over 30 years. As writers, they had struggled to pay the bills until they discovered the genre of soft porn romance novels. They cranked out 100 of them under a dozen pseudonyms and made enough money to retire to the island and live in a quaint old house just around the corner from Bruce. Now in their mid-70s, they wrote little. Lee fancied herself a tortured literary artist, but her writings were impenetrable, and her novels, the few she got published, sold next to nothing. She was always working on a novel, but never finishing one. She claimed to be embarrassed by the junk they had published, but enjoyed the money. Myra, on the other hand, was proud of their work and longed for the glory days, creating steamy sex scenes with pirates and young virgins and such. Myra was a large woman with a crew cut dyed lavender. In a lame effort to hide some of her bulk, she wore loud flowing robes that would work nicely as bed sheets for a queen-size bed. Lee, on the other hand, was tiny with dark features and long black hair pulled neatly back into a bun. Both ladies adored Bruce and Noelle, and the four dined together often. Myra gulped her brew and asked, "Have you seen Mercer?" "Yes, we had lunch today, along with Thomas, her bodyguard these days." "Is he cute?" Lee asked. "He's a nice-looking fellow, a few years younger, one of her students." "Go girl," Myra said. "Did you ever learn the real reason she left here so abruptly 3 years ago?" "Not really. Some sort of family business." "Well, we'll get to the bottom of it tonight. I can assure you of that." "Now, Myra," Lee said softly, "we'll not be prying." "Hell if we won't. Prying is what I do best. I want the gossip. Is Andy coming by?" "Maybe." "I'd like to see him. He was so much more fun when he was in the sauce." "Now, Myra, that's a touchy subject. If you ask me, there's nothing more boring than a sober writer." "He needs sobriety, Myra," Bruce said. "We've had this conversation." "And what about this Nelson Kerr fella? I find him boring even when he's not sober." "Now, Myra." "Nelson will be here," Bruce said. "I was thinking he might be a good match for Mercer, but she's occupied at the moment." "Who made you a matchmaker?" Myra quipped, as they noticed J. Andrew Cobb, or Bob Cobb as they called him, walk through the door. As usual, he was wearing pink shorts, sandals, and a gaudy flower shirt. Without missing a beat, Myra said, "Well, hello, Bob. You should not have dressed up for the occasion." She gave him a quick hug as Bruce stepped to the bar and mixed a vodka and soda. Cobb was an ex-con who'd served time in a federal pen for sins that were still vague. He wrote crime novels that sold well but had far too much prison violence, at least in Bruce's opinion. He hugged Lee and said, "Hello, ladies. Always a pleasure." "A good day on the beach?" Myra asked, looking for trouble. Bob's skin was a dark, leathery brown, a perpetual tan that he maintained with hours in the sun. His reputation was that of an aging beach bum who admired bikinis and was always on the prowl. He smiled at Myra and said, "Every day on the beach is a good one, my dear." "How old was she?" Myra asked. "Now, Myra," Lee cooed as Bruce handed him a drink. "Old enough, but barely," Bob said and laughed. Amy Slater was the youngest of the group and was making more money than all the rest of them combined. She had struck gold with a series about young vampires, and there was even a movie in the works. She and her husband Dan arrived on the veranda along with Andy Adam. Jay Arklerood was right behind them and managed a rare smile as greetings were made. He was a brooding poet who often dodged the dinners. Myra, the queen bee, had no use for him. Bruce fetched drinks and ice water for Andy and listened to the banter. Amy went on about her movie, whether there were problems with the script. Dan stood quietly by her side. He had retired from employment and took care of the kids so she could write full-time. The party was buzzing when Mercer and Thomas made their entrance. She swapped hugs as she introduced her new fella. The gang was delighted to see her and gushed about her new book, which most had read. As they talked, Nelson Kerr eased onto the scene and fixed a drink at the bar. He joined the circle around Mercer, and Bruce made the introductions. After a few minutes, the conversation spun off in different directions. Andy and Bruce discussed the storm. Myra cornered Thomas and began drilling into his past. Bob, Cobb, and Nelson had gone fishing the day before and needed to relive their catches. Lee was going through Mercer's novel chapter by chapter and couldn't get enough of the story. Drinks were refilled, and no one was in a hurry to sit down to dinner. The last guest to join them was Nick Sutton, a college boy who spent his summers on the island tending to a fine home owned by his grandparents. As was their annual ritual, they had fled the Florida heat and were roaming the country in a camper. Nick worked at the bookstore, and when he wasn't on duty, he surfed and sailed and looked for girls. He read at least one crime novel a day and dreamed of writing bestsellers. Bruce had read his short stories and thought the kid had talent. Nick had lobbied hard for the invitation to dinner and was almost overwhelmed to be included. At 7:30, Chef Claude informed Bruce that it was time to eat. Andy whispered to his host and eased away without another word. Sobriety was difficult enough during dry evenings. He wasn't tempted to drink, but the last thing he wanted was a 3-hour dinner with the wine flowing. Bruce pointed to chairs and got them seated properly. He sat at one end with Mercer, the guest of honor, at the other with Thomas to her right. There were 11 in all, the literary mafia of Camino Island plus Nick Sutton. Bruce passed along his best wishes from Noelle, who hated to miss the fun, but was with them in spirit. Everyone knew she was off in Europe with her steady French boyfriend, and no one was surprised. They had long ago accepted the fact of the open marriage, and no one cared. If Bruce and Noelle were happy, their friends were not about to question the arrangement. Bruce had never liked by-the-hour servers buzzing around his table and eavesdropping on the conversations, so he didn't use them. He and Claude poured the wine and water and served the first appetizer, a small bowl of spicy gumbo. "It's too hot for gumbo," Myra growled, mid-table. "I'll be soaked." "Cold wine always helps," Bruce shot back. "What's the main course?" "Everything spicy." Did I miss a page? Hang on. No. Everything spicy. Sorry about that. Bob Cobb said, "So Mercer, last stop on the tour, right? And I loved your book, by the way." "Thanks," she said. "Yes, the last stop. Coast to coast. Yes, 33 stops. Tomorrow's 34. "You'll have a huge crowd tomorrow, Mercer," Amy said. "A lot of the locals remember your grandmother, and they're very proud of you." "I knew Tessa," Bruce said. "But as I look around the table, I believe that no one here was living on the island when she died." "What was it, Mercer? 12 years ago?" 14. Myra said, "We moved here 13 years ago to get away from a bunch of writers. Look what's happened. Everyone followed us here." Bob said, "I believe I was next, about 10 years ago, right after I got paroled." "Please, Bob," Myra snapped. "No more prison stories. After your last book, I felt like I'd been gang raped." "Now, Myra." "So you liked it?" Bob asked. "Loved it." "Anyway," Bruce said loudly, "I'd like to propose a toast to, first of all, Mr. Leo. May he remain at sea and just go away. And more importantly, to our dear friend Mercer and her wonderful new book, number 5, On the Big List and Rising. Cheers." They clinked glasses and took a drink. "I have a question, Mercer," Lee said. "Did your grandmother, the real Tessa, really have a steamy romance with a younger man here on the island?" "That was the best part," Myra interjected. "That first seduction scene made my teeth sweat. Really well done, girl." "Thanks, Myra," Mercer said. "Coming from you, that's quite a compliment. Don't mention it. Of course, I would have gone overboard." "Now, Myra." "But yes, once I was old enough to realize what was going on, I suspected Tessa spent a lot of time with the younger man when I wasn't around." "And that was Porter in real life?" Lee asked. "Yes. Porter lived here for many years. 14 years ago, they died together in a storm." "I remember the storm and Porter," Bruce said. "It was one of the worst storms we've ever seen on the island, short of a hurricane." "Who's talking about hurricanes?" Amy asked. "Sorry," Bruce said. "We've had our share of glancing blows, but nothing terrible. The storm that got Tessa and Porter was an old-fashioned summer heat cell that came from the north with no warning." "And where was Tessa?" Amy asked. "I'm sorry, Mercer, if you don't want to talk about this." No, it's fine. "Tessa and Porter were not far out. Just a lazy summer's day in the sailboat. Porter and the boat were never seen again. Tessa was found in the surf near North Pier 2 days later." Myra said, "Well, thank God you didn't kill her off in your novel. I certainly would have." "You killed everyone, Myra," Lee said, after you ran them through the sex grinder." Murder sells, Lee, almost as much as sex. Remember that when all those royalty checks arrive." "So what's next, Mercer?" Bob Cobb asked. She smiled at Thomas and said, "Rest for a couple of weeks, though I'm already being hounded by Thomas and Bruce to start another novel." "I need something to sell," Bruce said. "So do I," added Lee, for a laugh. Jay, the brooding poet, said, "My last book sold 20 copies. No one reads poetry." As always, it was an awkward effort at humor and got a sympathetic laugh or two. Myra almost blurted something like, "And no one can read that crap you write." But instead she said, "I've told you before, Jay, you should write some really raunchy fiction under a pen name, make some money like Bob, and do your little poetry thing as the real you. Still won't sell, though." Bruce had seen this conversation go off the rails before, and he quickly intervened. "Can we toast the new deal, Mercer?" She smiled and said, "Oh, why not? Secrets are hard to keep around here." Bruce said, "A new 2-book deal with Viking as of this morning." They cheered and took turns congratulating Mercer as Claude removed the bowls. He poured more wine, a cold Chablis, and began serving the next course. A small platter of smoked oysters. A breeze materialized from the east and gently ruffled the thick air. On his trips to and from the kitchen, Claude kept one eye on the small television of the stove. Leo was still out there, drifting, churning, puzzling the experts with no apparent destination. I'm going to stop at this point, and I'll pick it up later. Thank you.